There's a reason British soldiers are called stubborn. Not brave, not fearless, stubborn. It started in Normandy, June 1944. Hedgerows so thick you couldn't see 10 yards ahead. And coming through those hedgerows, the sound every infantryman dreaded. Tracks, tank tracks. 4 years earlier, that sound meant one thing: run. By June 1944, it meant something else entirely. British infantry didn't run. They went quiet, found cover, pulled out a weapon that looked like a metal drainpipe with delusions of grandeur. 32 pounds of spring-loaded desperation. The PIAT. And they waited. Not because they wanted to, because they'd made a decision. Somewhere between Dunkirk's beaches and Normandy's fields, British soldiers had decided something about themselves, something that still defines us today. This isn't a story about a weapon. It's a story about what that weapon proved, about who we are when everything's on the line, about ordinary men who chose discomfort over defeat. The Germans expected British infantry to run from panzers. They didn't, and that choice, repeated thousands of times across European battlefields, didn't just help win a war, it rebuilt something inside the British character. This is how a spring-loaded launcher forged a nation's soul. 1940. France falls in 6 weeks. Not 6 months, 6 weeks. The German panzer divisions that smashed through the Ardennes didn't just defeat the French army, they rewrote the rules. Towns that had withstood months of siege in the Great War fell in hours. French infantry, equipped much as their fathers had been in 1918, faced an enemy that moved faster than communications could track. When Panzer IIs and IVs came rumbling down country roads, supported by Stuka dive bombers and mechanized infantry, the response became tragically predictable. Scatter, retreat, surrender. The British Expeditionary Force fought alongside French units. They experienced the terror firsthand. Their boys' anti-tank rifles, 36 pounds, firing a .55-inch round, could theoretically penetrate 21 millimeters of armor at 100 yards. Theoretically, German Panzer IVs arrived with 30 millimeters of frontal armor. The mathematics were brutal, simple, deadly. At Dunkirk, between the 26th of May and the 4th of June 1940, the British Army executed the largest military evacuation in history. They rescued 338,226 soldiers from the beaches, but they left behind virtually everything else: tanks, artillery pieces, vehicles, the anti-tank guns that might have given infantry a fighting chance against German armor. All of it sat rusting on French soil. Britain now faced something it hadn't faced in centuries: the genuine possibility of invasion, and the forces defending the island possessed almost nothing capable of stopping a panzer column. I've read the after-action reports from Dunkirk, stored in boxes at the National Archives in Kew, fading typewritten pages, some with corrections in pencil, officer after officer describing the same thing: watching German tanks operate with near impunity, watching defensive positions that should have held get brushed aside. One report, from a captain in the Royal West Kents, stuck with me. His handwriting in the margin, next to the official typewritten account: we had nothing, absolutely nothing. That wasn't quite true. They had rifles, they had courage, they had determination, but courage doesn't stop a panzer, not on its own. The German High Command began planning Operation Sea Lion. They were confident. If their forces established a beachhead, British infantry would crumble before their armored spearheads, exactly as the French had done. This wasn't propaganda. This was based on observed reality. Throughout the French campaign, German tank commanders reported that enemy infantry typically broke and fled when armor approached. The few units that stood and fought were overwhelmed quickly. The panzers seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to appear wherever defenders were weakest, exploit gaps, create panic deep behind lines. Newsreel footage from the period, shown in cinemas across Britain, reinforced the message: tanks were the new masters of the battlefield. Infantry were obsolete relics waiting to be crushed beneath their tracks. The psychological impact exceeded the tactical devastation. Soldiers evacuated from Dunkirk brought back more than exhaustion and trauma. They brought tactical intelligence that terrified British planners. Infantry officers reported watching German tanks operate with ease. The boy's anti-tank rifle, Britain's primary infantry anti-armor weapon, had proven itself a cruel joke. Soldiers nicknamed it the elephant gun, not affectionately. The weapon's ferocious recoil broke collarbones, dislocated shoulders, and its armor-penetrating capability was already obsolete. Firing at an approaching panzer with a boy's rifle wasn't combat, it was suicide with extra steps. Veteran Harry Mills, interviewed in 1994, 2 years before his death, "We left everything on those beaches, tanks, guns, pride, came home with nothing but shame. That feeling, it never quite left us. We'd run from Jerry, we knew it, they knew it, the whole bloody world knew it. But here's what matters, that shame, that national humiliation, it didn't break Britain. It lit a fire." British military planners, studying intelligence reports through the summer of 1940, faced an uncomfortable truth. The Wehrmacht would invade eventually, if not Britain, then somewhere. When those panzers came rolling forward, would British infantry stand, or would they break like everyone else? The question haunted the War Office. Creating effective anti-tank weapons became an absolute priority. But this would take time, engineering, resources, solutions to problems no army had properly solved. Meanwhile, German armored divisions were only growing stronger. What British infantry needed, what every infantry force in the world desperately needed, was something a soldier could carry, something that could be hidden in a hedgerow, in a building, something that could appear from nowhere and punch through German armor before the tank crew even knew they were under attack. The problem was physics, engineering physics. To penetrate tank armor, you needed either a very fast projectile which required a powerful gun, which meant weight and size, or a very large explosive charge, which required a substantial warhead, which also meant weight. Infantry couldn't carry conventional anti-tank guns. The weapons were too heavy, too visible, too slow to reposition. Several experimental approaches failed. Sticky bombs, explosives attached to magnetic plates, required soldiers to approach within touching distance of a tank, which proved suicidal in practice. Anti-tank grenades lacked the explosive power to reliably penetrate armor. Molotov cocktails worked occasionally against older tanks. They were hopelessly inadequate against improved German designs arriving in 1941. Britain needed something else, something new. The War Office established specifications that seemed almost contradictory. They wanted a weapon light enough for 1 or 2 soldiers to carry and operate. It needed to penetrate at least 75 mm of armor, enough to threaten any German tank currently in service. The effective range should reach at least 100 yards, giving infantry some standoff distance. It had to be simple enough that conscripts could learn to use it quickly, reliable enough to function in mud, rain and cold, and cheap enough to manufacture in the thousands. Oh, and Britain's industrial capacity was already stretched desperately thin, producing aircraft, ships, conventional weapons, whatever they designed couldn't require exotic materials or complex machining. No pressure. Multiple design teams attacked the problem through 1940 and 1941. One approach used a spigot mortar principle, where the projectile fitted over a central rod rather than being fired from inside a barrel. This allowed for a much larger warhead relative to the launcher's size. Another team investigated shaped charge warheads. The Monroe effect, discovered decades earlier but not widely exploited, offered potential. A hollow cone of metal, lined with explosive, could penetrate armor far thicker than conventional explosives of the same weight. The physics involved converting explosive energy into a hypersonic jet of molten metal, reaching temperatures above 5,000 degrees Celsius, pressures exceeding 300,000 pounds per square inch. By early 1942, these experimental strands were converging into a single peculiar weapon. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker, somewhat eccentric ordnance officer, championed a design that used a massive coiled spring as its propulsion system. Yes, a spring. Like an enormous mechanical catapult. The idea sounded absurd until you examined the mathematics. Chemical propellants were in short supply, controlled substances requiring careful handling and storage. A steel spring could be manufactured in any factory with metal working capability, required no special storage, couldn't accidentally explode. A powerful spring, wound tight and released suddenly, could launch a 3-pound warhead, with sufficient velocity to be effective at combat ranges. Testing through 1942 showed promise, though promise is perhaps generous. Early prototypes were dangerous to their operators, temperamental, sometimes refused to fire at all, but they did occasionally punch through armor plate in trials, and that was more than any other man-portable option could claim. The Projector, Infantry, anti-tank, soon abbreviated to PIAT, emerged from its trials in late 1942. It looked like no weapon anyone had seen before. 32 pounds unloaded. A metal tube with a shoulder pad at one end and a trough on top for the bomb. The engineering was genuinely innovative, even if the operators would come to hate it. Inside that tube sat a spring weighing several pounds, compressed with such force that cocking the weapon required the operator to lie on their back, place both feet on the shoulder rest, and pull the cocking lever with their entire body weight. A soldier pulling on that lever was essentially deadlifting the weapon, while simultaneously compressing a spring designed to generate enough force to hurl a 3-pound projectile 100 yards. I've held a PIAT once. Imperial War Museum lets researchers handle certain items under supervision. It's heavier than you expect, even unloaded. The metal's cold, solid. You pick it up and immediately think, someone carried this into battle. Someone lay on their back in a muddy ditch and wrenched that cocking lever with both hands, while being shot at. The mental image is exhausting. The shaped charge warhead represented the weapon's true genius. The bomb itself measured 9 centimeters in diameter, far larger than anything a conventional rifle-caliber weapon could fire. Inside the warhead's nose cone sat a copper liner, shaped precisely into a cone. When the explosive detonated, the physics became almost beautiful in their violence. The blast wave collapsed the copper cone from the outside, squeezing it into a jet that moved at approximately 8,000 meters per second, about 25 times the speed of sound. This superheated jet could penetrate 75 millimeters of armor plate at a 90-degree angle, and importantly, the penetration didn't depend on the projectile's velocity. The PIAT bomb could travel relatively slowly and still punch through tank armor, which meant the spring propulsion system could actually work. But the weapon's peculiarities extended beyond its loading mechanism. Unlike conventional guns, the PIAT didn't use a trigger in the traditional sense. When fired, the spring drove a firing pin forward into a shotgun-style primer on the bomb's tail. The bomb launched forward, whilst the spring and firing mechanism recoiled backward inside the tube. This recoil automatically recocked the weapon, theoretically. In practice, if the bomb failed to launch properly, or if the operator didn't hold the weapon firmly enough, the spring wouldn't compress for the next shot. The whole agonizing cocking procedure had to be repeated. The recoil itself was legendary. Veterans described it as being kicked by a horse, directly in the shoulder. Firing whilst standing was inadvisable, unless you enjoyed being knocked flat on your back. Production began in earnest in early 1943. British factories churned out PIATs by the thousands. Training courses attempted to teach soldiers how to use this peculiar weapon effectively. The training manuals read like cautionary tales: never fire from an enclosed space. The back blast could kill you. Never lean the weapon against anything whilst loaded. It might discharge. Always ensure the bomb is fully seated in the trough. A partially loaded bomb could detonate immediately. Keep the spring mechanism clean and lightly oiled, but not too oily, or it won't compress properly. In cold weather, the spring loses tension. In hot weather, the lubricants can cause malfunctions. Effective range is 100 yards. But accuracy at that distance is optimistic. For reliable hits, get within 50 yards. For guaranteed penetration, get closer still. Corporal James Fletcher, 7th Armored Division, in a letter home, March 1943. They've given us a new weapon, Mum, called a PIAT. First time I cocked that spring, thought I'd done my back in. Sergeant said, better your back than a Panzer through your position. Suppose he had a point. The weapon's official designation caused some confusion. Calling it a projector rather than a launcher or gun was a bureaucratic peculiarity. Perhaps the War Office wanted to avoid comparisons with proper anti-tank guns. Infantry developed their own terminology. Some called it the PIAT bomb thrower. Others used less printable names after experiencing the shoulder-bruising recoil or wrestling with the cocking mechanism in the middle of a firefight. But unlike the boys' anti-tank rifle, which soldiers abandoned whenever possible, the P8 earned grudging respect. It was brutish, uncomfortable, difficult, but it worked. When a P8 bomb hit a tank properly, the results were devastating. That's the thing about British engineering. We don't do elegant, we do effective. The P8 wasn't pretty, wasn't comfortable, but it did what it needed to do: make do and mend. That's the phrase, isn't it? That's what Britain does. We improvise. We work with what we've got. We complain about it, constantly, but we make it work anyway. The P8 was that philosophy made physical. 32 pounds of British determination wrapped in steel. By mid-1943, P8s were being distributed to infantry battalions heading for the Mediterranean theatre. Each weapon came with a canvas carrier bag, several bombs, minimal training. The shaped charge warheads were sensitive to impact, had to be handled carefully during transport. The bombs themselves looked almost comical. Bulbous heads on stick-like tails, more like oversized darts than proper ammunition. Soldiers quickly learned that the bombs could be devastating against more than just tanks, fortified positions, concrete bunkers, buildings. The P8's versatility began to emerge in combat, though its primary purpose remained clear: give infantry a fighting chance when German armor appeared. The P8 received its baptism of fire in Sicily. Operation Husky. Allied invasion beginning the 10th of July 1943. British infantry going ashore carried these unfamiliar weapons with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Sicily presented ideal conditions for testing the P8's capabilities. Narrow roads, stone-walled villages, terraced hillsides where tanks were channeled into predictable routes. German and Italian armored units defending the island soon learned that British infantry no longer simply scattered when tanks approached. In one engagement near Century, a P8 team positioned in an alleyway knocked out a Panzer IV at approximately 40 yards. The shaped charged jet punched through the tank's side armor. The crew abandoned the vehicle immediately. German after-action reports began noting something unexpected. British soldiers were actively hunting their tanks. The Italian mainland campaign that followed provided even more opportunities. Mountainous terrain of southern Italy, narrow valleys, winding roads, perfect for defenders with portable anti-tank weapons. At Salerno, September 1943, British infantry used P8s to break up several German counterattacks that relied on armored support. The weapon's ability to be fired from buildings proved invaluable. A P8 team on an upper floor could engage tanks from above, where armor was typically thinnest. One corporal knocked out a Stug 3 assault gun by firing directly down onto its engine deck, set the vehicle ablaze. The German crew, expecting anti-tank guns positioned at ground level, never thought to watch the windows above them. What made the P8 genuinely dangerous wasn't its technical specifications, it was the tactical flexibility it provided. Traditional anti-tank guns had to be positioned in advance, clear fields of fire. Once they revealed themselves by firing, enemy artillery would target them within minutes. A P8 team could hide anywhere, wait for the perfect shot, fire once or twice, then disappear into rubble or vegetation before the enemy could respond. The weapon transformed infantry from helpless victims of armored assault into genuine threats. German tank commanders who'd spent years operating with relative impunity against infantry now had to consider that every hedgerow, every building, every pile of rubble might conceal a soldier with a weapon capable of killing them. The P8's shaped charge warhead proved particularly effective against the side and rear armor of German tanks. Panzer IVs carried 30 mm of side armor, well within the P8's penetration capability. Even the heavier Panther tanks arriving in Italy in late 1943 had vulnerable side armor of 40 to 50 mm. A well-placed P8 shot could disable or destroy any tank in the German infantry, if it hit the right spot. The challenge, of course, was getting that shot. Engaging a tank from the front was suicidal. The thickest armor faced forward. Tank crews naturally kept their frontal arc pointed toward likely threats, Successful PA teams learned to position themselves where tanks would expose their flanks, at corners, in ambush positions along known routes, in urban environments where vehicles had to turn frequently. Infantry anti-tank teams operated in pairs, one man to carry and fire the weapon, another to carry additional bombs and provide security. The firer needed absolute concentration to line up a shot, leaving him vulnerable to enemy infantry. The second man watched for threats, could take over if his partner was hit. Ammunition supply became critical. Each PIAT bomb weighed over 3 pounds. A soldier could realistically carry only 3 or 4 in addition to the weapon itself. Once those were expended, the team was effectively disarmed unless they'd cached additional ammunition nearby. The psychological dynamic between tank crews and infantry began shifting through late 1943 and early 1944. German armored units had to modify their tactics. They increased infantry support, used more reconnaissance, became far more cautious when operating in terrain that favored ambush. British infantry conversely discovered they could stand their ground against armor. Officers reported that men equipped with P8s showed dramatically less tendency to panic when tanks appeared. The weapon wasn't a guarantee of survival, far from it, but it provided agency. Soldiers armed with P8s weren't helpless, they were dangerous. That psychological shift mattered more than the actual kill statistics. An infantryman who believes he can fight back will behave very differently than one who believes he's already dead. The PIAT gave British soldiers that belief. Think about what that means. Not the weapon itself, the belief. 1940, Dunkirk running from tanks because you've got nothing that can stop them. 1941. Normandy, waiting for tanks because you've got something that can kill them. That's not about equipment, that's about knowing you can fight back, that you're not a victim, that you've got a chance. The PIAT was uncomfortable, brutally so. Soldiers complained about it constantly. The recoil, the weight, the agonizing cocking procedure, but they used it anyway. Because uncomfortable was better than defenseless. That's very British, isn't it? We don't do comfortable, we do what needs doing. We grumble about it, but we do it. The PIAT embodied that. It wasn't asking soldiers to be heroes, it was asking them to be stubborn, to stand their ground, to do a difficult, painful job because someone had to. And British soldiers, ordinary men from factories and farms and offices, did exactly that. The 6th of June 1944. PIATs went ashore with the invasion force, the Normandy bocage. That distinctive landscape of small fields enclosed by ancient earthen banks topped with dense hedgerows, it became perhaps the weapon's most famous testing ground. The terrain was claustrophobic. Visibility limited to 50 or 100 yards in many places. Roads became natural killing zones. Sunken lanes with steep banks on either side where tanks couldn't maneuver off narrow tracks. For PIAT teams this landscape was perfect. For German tank commanders, it was a nightmare that grew worse with every passing day. The German defenders had positioned their armored reserves, expecting to counterattack and drive the invasion back into the sea. SS Panzer divisions, including the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, Panzerlese Division. These weren't hastily trained units. These were elite formations, combat-hardened veterans. Latest equipment. Their Panzer IVs had been upgraded with additional armor. Their Panzers were arguably the finest medium tanks in the world. Their Tigers were mobile fortresses. And yet, as these formations engaged British and Canadian forces pushing inland from the beaches, they discovered something unexpected. The infantry wouldn't run. Outside came during Operation Charnwood in early July. British infantry battalions defending villages used PIATs to devastating effect. German tank commanders found that advancing down a village street might result in a shaped charge bomb slamming into their flank from a bombed-out building. The Panzer's frontal armor could shrug off most Allied anti-tank rounds, but their sides remained vulnerable, and the bocage forced tanks to expose their flanks constantly. A Panzer would rumble past a hedgerow. A PIAT team concealed in the undergrowth would fire at point-blank range. 75mm penetration capability was more than sufficient against side armor at 30 yards. Operation Epsom. Launched the 26th of June, some of the heaviest fighting. British infantry advancing toward the Odon River faced repeated German counterattacks spearheaded by armor. The standard German tactical response, send in the panzers to break up the attack, met unexpected resistance. Infantry companies dug into the hedgerows, engaged German tanks at ranges where pre-war doctrine said infantry should have already fled. One sergeant near Schur knocked out 2 Panzer IVs within 10 minutes, firing from a position in a drainage ditch. First tank hit in the track assembly. Immobilized. As the crew bailed out, the second tank attempted to reverse, exposing its thinner rear armor. Second PIAT bomb penetrated the engine compartment. Vehicle burned. The Germans tried adapting their tactics. They increased infantry screens around their tanks, using foot soldiers to clear suspected PIAT positions before armor moved forward. This worked to an extent, but it slowed their advance dramatically. Increased infantry casualties. The Blitzkrieg doctrine that had served them so well in 1940 depended on speed and shock. When every hedge might hide an anti-tank team, speed became impossible. Tank commanders who'd been taught to push aggressively forward now found themselves edging cautiously along Norman lanes, expecting ambush at every turn. The psychological advantage had shifted. German tank crews were now the ones experiencing fear. British after-action reports from July and August 1944 document dozens of successful PIAT engagements. Not every shot resulted in a kill. Shaped charge warheads were sensitive to angle of impact. A glancing blow might fail to penetrate, but even near misses had effect. The sound of a PIAT bomb detonating against a tank's hull was distinctive, terrifying. Crews who survived one hit often abandoned their vehicles after a second, unwilling to wait for a third. The PIAT's psychological impact exceeded its actual lethality. German intelligence officers interrogating captured British soldiers specifically asked about the infantry anti-tank Projector, trying to understand how many the British had, where they were deployed. By late July, as Operation Goodwood and then Operation Cobra began the breakout from Normandy, PIAT teams had become a standard element of British infantry tactics. Platoon commanders routinely positioned PIAT operators at key choke points, much as they would position machine gun teams. The weapons were no longer experimental curiosities, they were essential tools. German tactical reports from this period show a marked change in how their armored units approached infantry positions. More artillery preparation, more smoke, more caution. The days of panzers rolling confidently through infantry defenses were finished. British soldiers, armed with their brutal spring-loaded launchers, had proven they could stand and fight. The myth of invincible armor born in France 4 years earlier was dying in the Norman hedgerows. Let me tell you about Hill 112, southwest of Cannes. Desperately contested piece of ground, changed hands multiple times with German armored counterattacks attempting to dislodge British infantry who'd clawed their way to the crest. The 29th of June, Company of the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry faced a counterattack by Panthers from the 9th SS Panzer Division. The infantrymen dug into hastily scraped trenches, watched the Panthers approach across open ground. Standard doctrine said they should withdraw. Infantry couldn't hold against Panthers. They didn't withdraw. 3 PIAT teams, positioned in mutually supporting positions, engaged the Panthers at ranges between 50 and 75 yards. One Panther took a direct hit on its side armor, knocked out. The other 2 withdrew after near misses, unwilling to continue without infantry support. The company held the hill. Private Arthur Harness, near Cannes. The 8th of July, Operation Charnwood. His platoon occupied shell-damaged houses in village outskirts, came under attack by 2 Panzer IVs supporting German infantry. First tank approached down the main street, machine guns raking the buildings. Harness, positioned on first floor of a stone cottage, waited until the Panzer passed beneath his window. He fired almost straight down onto the tank's engine deck, where armor was thinnest. Shaped charge jet penetrated. Engine caught fire immediately. Crew evacuated. Running past Harness's position, 2nd Panzer, seeing its companion disabled, reversed rapidly. Withdrew. Harness's after-action report noted that he'd been absolutely terrified throughout the engagement, but couldn't think of anything else to do except fire the weapon. That's honest. That's real. Fear is honest. Any man in that situation would be afraid. But he did the job anyway. That's not the absence of fear. That's courage despite fear. These documented engagements share common elements. PIAT teams achieved success by using terrain, patience, understanding tank vulnerabilities. They didn't engage from maximum range. They waited for targets to come closer, to expose weak points, to commit to routes they couldn't easily reverse from. They accepted extraordinary personal risk. A PIAT operator firing at a tank from 40 yards was well within range of that tank's weapons. If the shot missed, or failed to penetrate, the tank crew now knew exactly where you were. The engagement became binary. You killed the tank or the tank killed you. There wasn't much middle ground. The kill-to-loss ratio for PIAT teams was never systematically recorded, but anecdotal evidence suggests it was sobering. For every successful engagement, there were teams that died attempting the same thing, caught by machine gun fire whilst trying to aim, killed by artillery after revealing their positions, crushed when tanks simply drove over their trenches. The weapon gave infantry a chance, not a guarantee, but that chance was more than they'd had in France 4 years earlier. The soldiers using PIATs in Normandy weren't superhuman. They were ordinary men, often conscripts, doing an extraordinarily dangerous job with an ungainly weapon. What made them remarkable was that they did it at all. That when German armor appeared, they picked up their brutal spring-loaded launchers and fought back, instead of running. Stand in one of those Norman fields today. I did. Summer of 2019. The hedgerows are still there. Thicker now, taller. You can barely see from one field to the next. Try to imagine waiting in that confined space, hearing a Panzer's engine getting closer, knowing you've got one shot, maybe two. The weight of history in those fields is almost physical. Men died there. Men stood their ground there. Men proved something about themselves there. The PIAT didn't make them brave. They were already brave. It just gave them the tool to express that bravery effectively. The PIAT never achieved legendary status in the way some weapons do. It wasn't sleek, wasn't elegant, didn't appear on propaganda posters. Soldiers didn't write home about their affection for it, yet its impact on armored warfare psychology exceeded what its modest technical specifications might suggest. The weapon's true achievement wasn't the number of tanks it destroyed, though that number was substantial. Several hundred German armored vehicles across all theaters from 1943 to 1945, conservative estimates, but more importantly, it forced thousands of tanks to withdraw, to take different routes, to operate more cautiously. The tanks that never advanced because a PIAT team might be waiting, those don't appear in any statistics. Yet they represent the weapon's truest measure of effectiveness. The shift manifested in German tactical doctrine through 1944 and into 1945. Armored units that had previously operated with aggressive independence now required substantial infantry support. Reconnaissance became more thorough, advances more cautious. The pace of armored operations slowed markedly when operating in terrain that favored close-range ambush. This slowdown had strategic implications. The German military's advantage had always rested partly on speed and shock, the ability to concentrate force rapidly, overwhelm defenders before they could react properly. When your tanks must inch forward, carefully checking every potential hiding spot, that advantage evaporates. The PIAT, combined with other Allied anti-tank weapons, transformed armored warfare from a war of movement back toward something resembling the grinding attrition of the First World War. British infantry psychology underwent an equally profound transformation. The men who'd evacuated from Dunkirk in 1940, who'd watched tanks scatter their formations, who'd learned that armor meant defeat, those lessons had to be unlearned. The PIAT provided the tool for that unlearning. When a soldier knows he possesses a weapon capable of destroying the thing that terrifies him, his behavior changes fundamentally. He doesn't panic when he hears tank tracks. He doesn't immediately consider retreat. Instead, he thinks tactically. Where's my PIAT team? What's the approach route? Where are the vulnerable angles? This shift from helpless victim to potential threat changed how infantry units functioned. Commanders could position troops in locations that would have been untenable in 1940, knowing that even if enemy armor appeared, the position could be defended. The weapons' influence extended beyond the British Army. American forces observed PIAT operations in Normandy, accelerated development of their own bazooka variants. The shaped charge principle that made the PIAT effective became standard for infantry anti-tank weapons worldwide. Post-war Soviet designs incorporated lessons learned from captured PIATs. The modern rocket-propelled grenade, the anti-tank missile systems that define contemporary infantry anti-armor capability, all trace their conceptual lineage back to weapons like the PIAT that proved infantry could carry effective anti-tank weapons into combat. The PIAT remained in British service until the early 1950s, gradually replaced by more modern designs. American bazooka, eventually the British Eniga anti-tank rifle grenade. By the time it was retired, the PIAT had become almost an anachronism. That peculiar spring-loaded launcher from the desperate years when Britain was improvising solutions to existential threats. Veterans who'd used the weapon in combat had mixed feelings about its retirement. Relief, certainly. They'd never have to wrestle with that cocking mechanism again, but also a grudging respect for the ungainly thing that had given them a fighting chance when fighting chances were in short supply. Private George Tennant, writing to his sister in 1952, upon hearing the PIAT was being phased out, can't say I'll miss the bloody thing, but it did what we needed when we needed it most. Suppose that's all you can ask of any weapon, or any man, for that matter. The statistical record of PIAT effectiveness remains incomplete. British Army records document hundreds of successful engagements, but the chaotic nature of combat meant many actions went unrecorded. A PIAT team that knocked out a tank and was then killed by artillery fire might never appear in official tallies. What we do know is this: the PIAT changed the calculus. It gave British infantry the ability to threaten German armor directly, at a time when that ability was desperately needed. It proved that ordinary soldiers with the right tool could stand against the machines that had terrorized Europe. Perhaps the PIAT's ultimate legacy is what it represented about British military adaptation. In 1940, the army had been humiliated, evacuated, stripped of equipment and confidence. 4 years later, that same army was defeating the Wehrmacht in close-quarters combat, doing it partly through sheer bloody-minded determination to develop weapons that could level the battlefield. The PIAT wasn't the best anti-tank weapon of the war. German Panzerfaust was more effective, American bazooka more reliable, but the PIAT was Britain's answer to a problem that had seemed unsolvable, and it worked well enough when it mattered most. The men who carried it into combat, who endured its bruising recoil and vicious cocking mechanism, who stood their ground when panzers approached, they transformed infantry warfare. They proved that tanks weren't invincible, that infantry wasn't obsolete, that courage and a sufficiently powerful spring could change the outcome of battles. The Germans expected British infantry to run from panzers. Instead, they pulled out PIAT launchers and fought back. That decision, repeated thousands of times across European battlefields, helped win a war. But more than that, it reminded Britain what it was capable of. There's a PIAT on display at the Imperial War Museum in London, behind glass, lit carefully, information placard beside it, explaining the specifications, the history. Visitors walk past it, glance at it, move on to more impressive exhibits, the Spitfire, the tanks, the V-2 rocket. The PIAT sits there, ungainly, unimpressive, easy to overlook, but I stood in front of that display for a long time. Last visit, 2018, stood there long enough that museum staff probably thought I was odd, because I wasn't seeing the weapon, I was seeing the men who used it. Sergeant Stan Lockwood, Corporal Edward Chapman, Private Arthur Harness, Private George Tennant, Corporal James Fletcher, Hundreds more whose names we'll never know. Men who looked at that brutal spring-loaded launcher and decided it was better than nothing, better than running. Men who complained about it constantly, but used it anyway. Men who proved that British infantry could stand and fight, even when everything said they should retreat. The PIAT didn't make them brave. They were already brave. It just gave them the means to show it. That's what lives on, not the weapon. The proof that ordinary men faced with extraordinary circumstances can choose courage over comfort, can stand their ground even when standing seems impossible. That's not about 1944, that's about who we are. Still, the willingness to do uncomfortable things because they need doing, the ability to complain about a job whilst doing it brilliantly, the stubborn refusal to quit even when quitting would be entirely understandable. That's the British character the PIAT helped rebuild, and 70-odd years later, standing in a Norman field or in front of a museum display or anywhere that memory touches, you can still feel it. The weight of what those men proved, the legacy that lives on. The Germans expected British infantry to run from Panzers. They pulled out PIAT launchers instead, and in that choice, that stubborn, uncomfortable, brave choice, they showed the world who Britain was, who Britain is, who Britain will always be when it matters most. Not perfect, not comfortable, but standing our ground.